What if humanity's oldest stories aren't simply trying to explain where we came from? What if they're trying to remind us where we're going? Throughout history, civilizations separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years have told remarkably similar stories. Stories of a time when humanity lived differently. A time before division, before endless conflict, before humanity seemed disconnected from the divine, from nature, and perhaps even from one another. The ancient Greeks remembered a golden age. The Hebrew scriptures begin in a garden. Hindu tradition speaks of Satya Yuga, an age of truth. Taoist philosophy looks back towards effortless harmony with the Tao. Many indigenous traditions preserve stories of living in right relationship with the land, the community, and the sacred. Different civilizations, different languages, different understandings of reality, and yet, once again, a remarkably familiar pattern begins to appear. Throughout history, people have offered many explanations for why these stories seem to echo across cultures. Some see them as symbolic myths, some see them as reflections of universal human longing. Others wonder whether fragments of ancient memories survive through story. Still others believe they preserve glimpses of a deeper spiritual reality that humanity has never completely forgotten. Whether any of those explanations are correct isn't the question we're exploring today. Instead, I'd like to do something much simpler. I'd like to place some of humanity's oldest stories side by side and simply observe. Because something interesting begins to happen when we stop asking which story is true and begin asking why so many stories keep remembering the same kind of world. Over the next few minutes, I'd like to explore 4 recurring movements that seem to appear again and again: harmony, separation, remembering, and return. Not to argue that every tradition is saying exactly the same thing. Not to erase the differences that make each tradition unique. But to ask a question that I don't think we ask often enough. Why do so many cultures preserve stories that seem to point humanity toward restored relationship with the divine, with one another, with nature, and perhaps with reality itself? You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. And perhaps that's where the first pattern begins to emerge. Because before these stories describe humanity's struggles, before they describe division, before they describe conflict, they often begin somewhere else, in harmony. In the book of Genesis, humanity begins in a garden. God walks with Adam and Eve. The earth provides abundantly. There is no shame, no hiding, no separation between humanity, creation, and the divine. Relationship comes first. In Hindu tradition, Satya Yuga is remembered as an age of truth. Dharma, the natural order of reality, stands firmly on all 4 of its legs. Human beings are said to live with wisdom, integrity, and spiritual awareness. Harmony is not something that people struggle to create. It's simply the way the world is. Hesiod describes the Greek Golden Age as a time when people lived without endless labor or violence. The earth gave freely. Justice came naturally. Human life unfolded with a kind of ease that later generations would remember but no longer possess. Taoist philosophy speaks of living in effortless harmony with the Tao, the deeper current that flows through all things. Rather than forcing life into submission, people flourish by living in accordance with its natural rhythm. Among many indigenous traditions, humanity is understood as living within a web of relationships. The land is not merely property. The animals are not merely resources. Rivers, mountains, plants, and people all participate in a living community where respect and reciprocity sustain the whole. Different civilizations, different symbols, different understandings of reality. And yet another remarkably familiar pattern begins to appear. Before humanity is divided, it belongs. Before conflict becomes the story, relationship is the story. Which raises an interesting question. Why do so many civilizations begin by remembering a world where human beings lived in right relationship with the divine, with one another, and with the living world around them? Perhaps because these stories are remembering history. Perhaps because they are expressing humanity's deepest hopes. Or perhaps because they're preserving an orientation, a reminder of the kind of relationship human beings have always longed to recover. Whatever the explanation, the pattern is remarkably difficult to ignore. And perhaps that's where the next pattern begins to emerge. Because as so many traditions begin in harmony, something else almost always follows: separation. In Genesis, humanity eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Shame appears, hiding begins, the relationship between humanity, the divine, one another, and even the earth itself changes. In Hesiod's telling, the Golden Age gives way to successive ages of increasing hardship. Human life becomes marked by conflict, labor, and decline. Each age moves a little farther from the harmony that came before it. Hindu tradition describes a gradual movement from Satya Yuga into later yugas, where truth slowly diminishes, conflict increases, and human beings become progressively more disconnected from Dharma. Rather than living in effortless alignment, harmony must now be consciously sought. Taoist writings often describe humanity as drifting away from the Tao. The more people attempt to dominate, control, and force the world, the more they seem to lose the effortless harmony that once guided life. Many indigenous traditions also preserve stories in which human beings gradually forgot right relationship with the land, with one another, or with the sacred responsibilities that once sustained the community. Different stories, different symbols, different explanations, and yet another remarkably familiar movement begins to appear. Something becomes fractured. Relationship gives way to separation. Harmony gives way to striving. Belonging gives way to forgetting, which raises another interesting question. Why do so many civilizations remember not only a time of harmony, but also a movement away from it? Perhaps these stories are trying to explain why suffering exists. Perhaps they preserve cultural memories of historical change. Or perhaps they're describing something every human being experiences within a single lifetime. Most of us know what it feels like to lose our sense of connection, to become disconnected from ourselves, from other people, from nature, or from whatever we understood as sacred. Whatever these stories ultimately mean, they seem remarkably consistent in one observation. Before restoration comes, something is first forgotten. And perhaps that's where the story becomes even more interesting. Because if these traditions remembered harmony and remembered separation, why didn't they simply let those stories disappear? Why preserve them for centuries, sometimes for thousands of years? Across civilizations, something remarkable begins to happen. Stories are told and retold. Parents tell them to children, elders pass them to the next generation, sacred texts preserve them, ceremonies reenact them, songs remember them, communities gather around them. Different cultures preserve different details, but they all seem remarkably unwilling to forget. Which raises another interesting question. What exactly were they trying to preserve? Were they preserving history, identity, hope, or perhaps something even more fundamental? An orientation, a reminder of what right relationship looked like, even if it was no longer fully present. Perhaps that's one of the purposes of myth itself. Not simply to explain the past, but to keep pointing towards something worth remembering. And perhaps that's why these stories continue to resonate today. Because most of us have experienced moments, however brief, when life seemed a little more connected. A quiet walk through the woods, a moment of profound prayer, the birth of a child, the death of someone we love, a sunset that somehow silences every thought for just a moment. Moments when the world seems to become whole again. Perhaps that's why these ancient stories still speak to us. Not because they ask us to escape the present, but because they remind us that another way of relating has always remained possible. Whatever else these stories may be, they seem to function less like maps of a forgotten world and more like compasses, quietly pointing humanity towards something it has never entirely stopped seeking. Perhaps that's why they have endured for so long. Not because humanity remembered the past perfectly, but because we never completely lost our longing for home. Not necessarily a place, but a way of being, a way of relating, a way of belonging. And perhaps that's where the final pattern begins to reveal itself. Because if these stories begin in harmony, remember separation, and refuse to let humanity forget, what are they ultimately pointing toward? Again and again, the answer seems surprisingly familiar. Return. The Bible doesn't end in the Garden of Eden. It ends with a vision of a new Jerusalem where heaven and earth are reunited, where God dwells with humanity once again, and where separation itself is finally overcome. Hindu tradition teaches that after the long cycles of decline, a new Satya Yuga begins. The cycle turns. Harmony is not gone forever, it returns. Many Buddhist traditions describe vast cycles of decline and renewal, where periods of forgetting are followed by renewed awakening and the reappearance of wisdom. Taoist philosophy is filled with invitations to return, not backward through history, but inward toward harmony with the Tao that has never truly disappeared. Among many indigenous traditions, ceremonies, stories, and daily practices are not simply ways of preserving the past, they are living acts of remembering, renewing right relationship with the land, with the community, and with the sacred in the present. Different traditions, different symbols, different visions of what restoration looks like, and yet another remarkably familiar movement begins to appear. Not simply remembering, returning, which raises one final question. What if humanity's oldest stories were never primarily trying to tell us where we came from, but what if they were trying to help us remember what we're capable of becoming? Perhaps that's why these stories continue to endure. They don't simply describe a lost world, they preserve hope. Hope that relationship can be restored. Hope that humanity can learn. Hope that what has been forgotten can also be remembered. Whether we understand these stories as history, symbol, sacred revelation, or something else entirely, they seem to share one quiet conviction: that separation is not the end of the story. And perhaps that's the most remarkable pattern of all. So where does that leave us? Perhaps exactly where we started. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. Whether these stories preserve history, symbol, collective memory, or glimpses of a deeper spiritual reality, they all seem to ask something remarkably similar of us. Remember. Remember that relationship matters. Remember that harmony is possible. Remember that separation is not necessarily the end of the story. And remember that what has been forgotten can sometimes be found again. Perhaps that's why these stories have endured for thousands of years. Not simply because they tell us about the past, but because they continue inviting each new generation to ask what kind of world it wants to help create. If civilization separated by geography, language, and history all preserve stories of humanity living in deeper relationship with the divine, with one another, with nature, and with reality itself, then perhaps the most interesting question isn't whether they all remembered the same past. Perhaps it's why they all kept pointing toward a remarkably similar future. And perhaps it's also worth wondering why so many of those same stories remember forces that continually interrupt the journey through separation, fear, pride, or division. But that'll be a story for another day. For now, I'd simply invite you to notice. Notice the stories humanity has carried across thousands of years. Notice the patterns that continue to emerge. And perhaps Notice the moments in your own life when the world has felt, however briefly, like home. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week. We're going to start a 3-part series on cycles and renewal and what it may mean for you. I'll see you there.